Welcome to the Victims of Crime course. This is your PowerPoint video for Chapter 1, Intro to Victimology. So first we're going to talk a little bit about what victimology is, and it's the scientific study of crime victims. So just like we scientifically study crime, we also study victims as well. So we're looking at the causes of victimization, its consequences, and how criminal justice system assists victims. So the sort of grandfather of victimology, I guess you would say, is Benjamin Mendelsohn, and he coined the term victimology in 1947. And it's really considered a subfield of criminology, so mostly studied by criminologists, also, sociologists, psychologists as well. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the history of victimology. So prior to and during the Middle Ages, so the 5th through the 16th century, the victims were the focus of the justice system. So it was up to the victim and the victim's family to seek justice themselves. So if somebody victimized you, maybe they stole something from you, you wouldn't necessarily go, there wasn't a criminal justice system to go to, but you would sort of take matters into your own hands and sort of right the wrongs that had been done to you. So the whole idea surrounding this is retribution or lex talionis. So this is an eye for an eye. So, if someone hurts you, you hurt them right back. Again, crime is a harm against the victim, not the state. So the state really, didn't have anything to do with it. If you were victimized by somebody, you dealt with your own problems. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the role of the victim in crime. So one thing that sort of has been an issue in the study of victimology is victim blaming, or people criticizing sort of the study of victimology as blaming the victim for their own crime, which really is not what we're doing. We're trying to find out maybe why one person is more likely to be victimized than another in order to prevent victimization. So some of the early perspectives that we're going to be talking about were especially problematic. They were really victim blamey. And we do not study victimization in this manner anymore. We never say, it's the victim's own fault for getting victimized. But some of the early scholars that studied victimization were very victim blamey. Again, we're not holding the victim responsible for what happened to them. We're just really trying to understand why in order to prevent victimization. So one of the terms that were used a little bit that is, one of the early ways of looking at victimization is victim precipitation. So this is the extent to which a victim is responsible for her own victimization. So for example, using fighting words or, taunting the offender. Again, we don't talk about victimization like this anymore, but, back when the study of victimization was still young, this is a term that a lot of the scholars used. So again, victim facilitation. So this is an irresponsible act by a victim and was sort of seen by a victim getting taken advantage of by an offender. So this is a victim unintentionally making it easier for an offender to commit a crime. So for example, leaving your purse or wallet in plain view, not locking your front door and getting burglarized, and victim provocation. So this is when you're inciting someone to commit a criminal offense against him or her. So for example, without the victim's behavior, the crime would not have occurred. So if a burglar gets shot while breaking into somebody's house, this would seem as victim provocation. So, if the victim wasn't breaking into somebody's house, they would not have been shot. Okay, so some of these early theorists that we're going to talk about, again, Benjamin Mendelsohn, the father of victimology, in the 1940s, he was sort of the first one to realize that it wasn't random and victims and offenders often knew each other. He created a classification of victims based on their culpability from completely innocent to a guilty victim. So his example of like a completely innocent victim would maybe be, a small child getting victimized, while a guilty victim would be, the person breaking into somebody's house and then getting shot. Again, we don't talk about victims and how culpable they are for their what happened to them, but this is one of the ways that it was talked about in the 1940s. Hans von Hentig, again in the 40s, he studied victimization like we also study crime. So he wanted to really consider the victim and offender in a dyad or a relationship in order to fully understand victimization. So we have to understand the crime and why it took place and the offender in order to understand victims as well. Again, he was one of these guys that was kind of victim blamey, and he created 13 risk categories. So 13 reasons why people are victimized. So these include being young, being female, and being what he would say mentally defective. And, he used these to explain why some people were victimized. Okay, another one of our early theorists, Martin Wolfgang. And he was one that really used sort of theory and empirical evidence to look at victimization. So he discovered that 26% of homicides were precipitated, and he found these sort of common characteristics in precipitated homicides. So the victim and offender, they often knew each other. Alcohol was likely involved, and homicides involved male victims and male offenders. He created this sort of category called subintentional homicide, where the victim sort of facilitates his or her own death. Again, very victim blamey. We don't talk about victimization like this anymore. But Wolfgang said that those that used poor judgment, that placed themselves in risky situations, used drugs and alcohol, and sort of lived very risky lifestyles. So maybe they were involved in offending, maybe they're involved in, the drug trade, just, being around risky people doing risky things. These are the ones that sort of facilitate their own death or made it more likely for them to be victimized. Menachem Amir, he was one of the first to study sexual assault and rape. And he looked at victim precipitation in rape cases. So he concluded that 20% of cases were precipitated. So these rapes that were precipitated involved alcohol, involved the victims engaging what he called seductive behavior, and had what he would consider to be a bad reputation. So this is a very controversial study. People really did not like it because he blamed the victim for their own victimization. Again, we do not blame sexual assault victims for what happened to them. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about, the chapter of sexual assault. So this was considered a very controversial study, and we definitely don't use, his findings of the study today when we talk about sexual assault victimization. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the victims' right movement and sort of how victimization became sort of something that we thought about and studied rather than, just focusing solely on the offenders of crime. So the President's Commission of Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice, 1966, put out the first government-sponsored victimization survey. Called the National Crime Survey. Now we call it the NCVS. We're going to talk about this at length in other chapters. So before, we would keep track of how many maybe crimes took place, but we really didn't look at it from, the victim's point of view at all. So this really shed light on how much crime was not reported to the police, or the dark figure of crime. Again, we'll talk about this at length in the next chapter. And they really identified why people were reluctant to report to law enforcement. So there's really two main movements that sort of led to the victims' right movement. The first was the women's movement, brought attention to violence against women. So this was sort of a byproduct of sexism, traditional sex roles, and family values. It also brought attention to the effects of victimization on children as well. And there were sort of three critical developments that came out of the study of victimization through the women's rights movement. The first is that victimization not only causes physical harm, but also emotional and mental harm as well. And these are harms that must be addressed in order to, victims to move on with their lives. Additional victimization by the criminal justice system happens. and we should try our best to avoid that. And we need shelters and centers that rely on volunteers so that they can remain open even without budgetary support. Along with the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement was, very important in, um, sort of bringing forward the victims' rights movement and making this sort of an issue that more people were aware of. So it really brought attention to the mistreatment of minorities by the criminal justice system as both offenders and as victims. And it advocated against racism and discrimination. So the victims' rights movement was largely put forth by women, by minorities, and by young people, so not necessarily the people that are generally in power and generally have political power to pass laws and make changes. It was mostly, by the people that generally don't have a lot of power. So women, minorities, and young people. Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about some of these contributions of the victims' rights movement. So 1965, California had the first victims compensation program. So this was financial compensation for harms that might have been done. So maybe this is physical injury. Before that, we really, you didn't necessarily get compensation from any sort of government program. 1972, 3 victim assistance programs were developed across the United States. So these were rape crisis centers to help victims of rape. 1974, the first prototypes of a victim and witness assistance program were put in place. So programs that were responsible for notifying victims of their court proceedings and to provide guidance during the court process. Again, we're going to talk about these sorts of programs at length in later chapters. I think this is chapter 6, if I remember correctly. So the development of victim organizations, we suddenly sort of started to recognize that there are secondary victims as well. So people affected by the victimization of a loved one, but don't necessarily, weren't the main victims of the crime. So maybe they weren't the ones being murdered, but they are still secondary victims because a loved one was affected by this victimization. The National Origin for Victims Assistance, developed in 1975 to consolidate purposes of victims' rights movement, so sort of like a one-stop shop in order to get assistance if you're a victim of crime. So legislation and policy. So there really wasn't a lot of legislation in place until 1980, where Wisconsin was the first state to pass a victim's Bill of Rights. So these are things that the victim can expect from the state if they were a victim of crime. So 1980, there's a national organization for victim assistance policy platform. 1980, again, President's Task Force on the Victims of Crime. Had 4 main initiatives. First, federal legislation for state victims to receive compensation and local assistance programs. Recommendations for those that work with victims, so people that are working in emergency rooms, people who were working in the criminal justice system, some recommendations on how to best assist those victims. A creation of task force on family violence. Again, before this, family violence was really something that was sort of, dealt with in your own family. So this really brought it to the forefront and kind of, showed people the sort of violent acts that were, happening in families. They also recommended a victims' rights amendment at this time. So the Victims of Crime Act, put forth in 1984, established a crime victims fund. So these are funds that can be used if you're a victim of a crime. Again, we're going to talk about this at length in a later chapter. Establish an office for victims of crimes. So, an area to go if you're a victim and you need some assistance. 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. It included the Violence Against Women Act. And the Violence Against Women Act is a research and professional partnership to address violence against women. And there's special programs for Native American women and LGBTQ+ populations. So 1998, new directions from the field. So these were investigated where we're at with the recommendations for the presidential task force and sort of what needed to happen going forward. 1990s, state efforts to afford victim rights. So right for trials, so the right to be present, to have a separate waiting area, separate from the accused, the right to receive notifications about what's happening in your case or what's happening with the accused, if they're convicted, if they're out on parole, if they're out on bail. And you have rights to be informed about the compensation that's available, maybe compensation for missing work or medical bills or therapy, etc. And also the right to be treated with dignity and respect. 2004, the Justice for All Act. Again, it just more of these victims' rights that we're going to talk about in a later chapter. So victimology today. So this will just give a little overview about what things we're going to be talking about in future chapters. So today we study the crime victim. So we study who's more likely to be a victim. And it's more prevalent than originally thought. We talk a little bit about the typical victim and what makes them typical, and maybe the atypical victim. So typical victim is generally a young male who lives in an urban area, but of course it's different for all types of crime. Other populations that are at high victimization risk are homeless individuals, individuals with mental illness, disabled individuals, and incarcerated individuals. So we're going to talk a little bit about the causes and the correlates of victimization. So we develop theories to explain, why victimization takes place, explain why some people are more likely than others to be victimized. We generally use criminological theories that we apply to victims. So two of the most popular theories to explain victimization are the routine activities theory, or, the different routines that you take in your day-to-day life and how this makes it more likely that one person will be victimized than another. And then lifestyle theory. So the theory that engaging in, a risky lifestyle, so being around risky people, doing risky things, will make you more at risk for being victimized. Talk a little bit about the cost of victimization. So this can be a tangible cost. So, the financial cost of a stolen property, the medical bills that might result, mental health issues, and the cost of therapy. The money spent by the criminal justice system. So the criminal justice system spends a huge amount of money on, funding for policing, for the courts, for the correctional systems as well. Preventing and responding to crime, and sort of these not untangible costs like fear. So fear of being a victim, and how the fear of being a crime victim can cause somebody to maybe not engage in activities that they enjoy, or activities that they used to like doing. So we're going to talk about the crime victim and the criminal justice system. We're going to talk about why most crime victims don't report their victimization to police. We're going to talk a little bit about distrust of the police, and what makes people less likely to call the police if they are a victim of crime. For one, they might not take them seriously. The cop may think it's a waste of time. Victims generally are not really treated with respect or dignity by the criminal justice system. They might just think that, they're better off just sort of dealing with their victimization themselves. We're going to talk about the crime victim and social services. So victims might need to interact with doctors, nurses, social workers, therapists, etc., etc. And a lot of times these professionals don't necessarily have maybe proper training, and they might not treat victims with the care and the sensitivity that they need. In this course, we're going to talk about knowing why someone is victimized in order to establish preventions. So we're going to talk about effective prevention programs. So these involve knowing the extent to which people are victimized, who is likely targeted, and the reasons why people are victimized. So we must look at both the offender and the victim in order to, best prevent victimization. So we talk a lot about changes that potential victims can make. So this will, make it less likely that someone is victimized without having to necessarily, while we want to change the offender's behavior, sometimes it's, not in our hands. No, we're not able to do so. So we talk a little bit about, how victims might best protect themselves.